We have a significant gap to deal with in fiscal year '09 still, despite our recent efforts that cut over $15 million from our annual budget. I have quite a few slides though to go through on some of the details. One of the first things I wanted to hit on, and Maria mentioned briefly, is for the first time in this budget, we are creating a development services fund. This continues a trend we started last year of budgeting various cost centers directly within their funding sources. So for example, last year, our sewer crews, we moved them out of the general fund and budgeted them directly in the sewer fund. Our redevelopment staff, we moved out of the community development department and budgeted them directly in the redevelopment agency, as opposed to doing all these transfers, which made things not quite as transparent, quite frankly. What this is showing you then is what we would be proposing as a new development services fund comprised of these units. A significant chunk of the planning and building department. You can see the divisions there. It's 49.5 of their 71.5 authorized positions. The remaining 22 positions being dedicated to their advanced planning functions and code enforcement functions. Those staff and those functions would remain in the general fund, but all of these other functions, development planning, community planning, plan check, field inspections, and their front counter operations would be moved out of the general fund into this development services fund and supported by development related revenues. You can see from the engineering and general services department, subdivisions, permits, landscaping, and transportation planning, all functions related to development activity, 13.5 FTEs. And then from the public works department, construction inspections and landscape inspections, 15 FTEs. And all 78 full-time employees being moved out of the general fund into a dedicated development services fund. What we have then is a complete cost center that's associated with the delivery of development processing services from the very initial stages of the entitlement process all the way through the final inspection and permitting and occupancy. Why do we want to do this? And you can apply these reasons really to all the other things we've done in terms of moving the sewer staff out and the redevelopment agency staff out. It really, I think, improves the transparency of the budget. It clearly separates, in this case, development revenues from general revenues. Why that's good for us is it clearly demonstrates if we're maintaining the council's policy that new development and development-related activities should pay for themselves. From the standpoint of the developers, they can clearly see that the fees they're paying are going to support development-related activities, and they're not getting lost in the shuffle of the entire general fund. That hadn't been happening in the past, but it was not as easy to see when all those revenues are mixed in with sales tax revenues and property tax revenues and general revenues. So this clearly separates those development-related revenues and development-related costs into a separate cost center. This does a lot to clarify the nexus between the costs we incur as a city in providing those services and the fees that we're charging for those services, and then ultimately the revenues that are collected from those fees. And also having this set up as a separate fund will allow this fund to maintain reserves separate from the city's general fund reserves. That's the same situation that the redevelopment agency currently does, the same situation as the sewer. They can maintain their own level of reserves separate from the general fund, which will help smooth transitions as development activity bounces up and down. There will be some reserves there to assist with those transitions, and it'll protect the general fund reserves from being impacted as they have been in recent years as a result of the downturn in development activity. In terms of the numbers, this is what it looks like currently after we've split these departments apart. All those cost centers, look at the second half of the slide first, all those cost centers I just went over, the 78 staff and those various functions, comes to $12 million, a little bit over $12 million of expenses. And you can see at the top the revenues we're projecting from these development services areas. And these revenue projections are based upon continuation of development activity, essentially at the level we've seen in the current year, which is about 600 units. Actually, the last time I talked with our planning and building director, they're now feel that they're actually going to come in above the 600 units, but as we're projecting out the fiscal year '09 and beyond, we're going to stay with a conservative assumption of 600 units per year. You can see, though, You can see though that we have a gap in this fund right out of the bat, that the revenues we're anticipating to come in from development activity through the fees that we collect from development activity are insufficient to pay for all the costs that we have associated with delivering those services. Before we go to the next slide, there's two line items in here I wanted to just focus on a little bit. I'll describe them more on the next slide. Is on the revenue side, you can see a transfer in of $386,000. Most of that coming as a transfer from the general fund. That's related to fee subsidies that the council has authorized. And I'll talk about those on the next slide. And then you can also see on the expenditure side, transfers out from this fund to the general fund to cover overhead expenses that aren't actually reflected in this cost center. I want to show you this slide so you can actually see how this works and I think how it helps to improve the transparency. If you look at this as actually two separate pots of money, two separate funds, which they are now. You have on the left a development services fund and on the right your general fund. And the blue squares or circles are your revenues and the red squares are your expenditures. And so if you look at this, you can see on the development side, you're showing that $11.1 million of revenue. Some of that revenue is actually coming from the general fund. Because when the council authorized the fee study, they authorized subsidizing certain development permits, particularly on things like hot water heaters, where the fee would maybe be $250 and you'd get a lot of people installing them without the appropriate permits. And so council authorized a fee of $51 and is subsidizing that additional amount. This makes it extremely explicit that that has been approved and the general fund is indeed picking up that additional cost for those permits. And so in order to make that work, we actually have to have the general fund subsidize the development services fund by the amount that council has authorized. Now at the same time, when you look at that development services expense of $12.1 million, part of that expense is an explicit line item to cover citywide and departmental overhead costs. And you can see the amount's $2 million here. The way we calculate that amount is to look at all of the city's indirect cost centers. This ranges from the office of mayor and council yourselves, to the city clerk, to the attorneys, finance, human resources, information technology, all these aspects of the city government that makes, that are kind of behind the scenes that support these functions. They get identified. Custodial costs are also in there. These costs are all identified and then they're allocated out to the different direct services units. Also in that overhead amount, in the case of engineering and public works, their overhead costs associated with the director of the department, the analysts in the department, the assistant director of the department, different supervisors and some clerical support, those costs are also identified and allocated out. So we didn't budget those costs directly in the fund because it gets a little too complicated to start peeling out pieces of staff. Instead, what we do is we use a cost allocation plan and basically identify the amount of overhead that is allocated to this development services group, and then the development service group essentially pays the general fund for those services. And that's how it all works. You could just net it out, obviously, and just have a $1.7 million transfer from the development services fund to the general fund, but having it this way makes it very explicit that that fee subsidy is being paid and that the overhead costs are being recovered.